The story of Baykok. Are you awake? Omimi whispered as low as she could, as to not awaken or alarm the children. Receiving no answer, she nudged her husband, Wabakuku. Wake up! What is it? He answered sleepily. Listen, she said. With the wind winding through the trees and the breakers battering the rocky shore, it was difficult to hear. Still, they made out a melancholy, thin voice, an eerie voice, calling, Help me! Someone! I can't get out! Omimi pressed closer to her husband and began to shiver. I'm afraid. It doesn't sound like a man or a woman. Shh! I can't hear. Wabekuku hushed his wife. Omimi lay still. In the dark, she felt her husband prop himself on one elbow and suspend his breathing. Help me! And the rest of the words were muffled by the fresh burst of wind. Someone's down at the shore. Wabakuku ventures after some moments. I'm going down to see what the matter is and to give what help I can. He cast the blankets aside and fumbled with his leggings and moccasins. Wait for me. I'm coming with you, Omimi hissed at her husband, and she fumbled in the dim light cast by the red embers of the fire to find her dress, moccasins, and wrap, while Wabakuku waited. Where are you two going? Omimi's mother asked. Wabakuku explained that they are going down to the shore to see who is asking for help. Didn't you hear anyone calling? He asked. Yes, I did, but it didn't sound like a human being to me. Leave it. Don't go down there. Don't worry, we'll be right back, Wabekuku assured his mother-in-law as he followed his wife out of the lodge. Though the wind blew with gale force, it was not cold, nor was it as dark as might be expected of a blustery night. Driven by the whipping wind, clouds raced across the sky, shrouding the moon and casting the earth into darkness, then blowing by and brightening up the land. Help! Before it's too late! This way! Needji! This way, Wabekuku directed his wife towards the shore over the boulders and shrubs. Watch your step. Wabekuku and Omimi were near the shore, looking up and down the length of the lakeside, when the clouds unshrouded the moon. Sprays of water fell on them as waves broke over boulders. Needji, help me, came the call, directly in front of them. Wabekuku looked. Ya! Omimi screamed as her knees buckled and she slumped to the ground. An instant later, Wabekuku saw it too. A skull wedged between boulders, rolling to and fro according to the motion of the water. His knees gave way, and he sat, quaking, on his hunches beside his wife's form. He rests his hands on her shoulder. Needji, the skull says, I can't hurt you. Don't be afraid of me. I can't even touch you, as you can see. Help me! Wabekuku opened his mouth. His jaw went slack, and he could not utter a word, not a sound. He could only gape in repugnance at the skull. Need ye, the skull spoke again. Why look at me in loathing as if I was something abominable? You ought to know that I was once like you, and that you will some day look like me. Instead of shrieking from me, you should bear me some sympathy and tolerance and understanding. What do you want? Wapekuku stammered. My bones are scattered. As you can see, I am Baykok. I am broken, dismembered. Now just a skull. Put my bones together in their natural order. Make me an entity, complete, and I shall never more disturb beings of flesh. But I'm not a medicine person. Only they are warranted to communicate with the dead. And why are you still here? Why are you not in the land of souls with your kin and ancestors? Dearly would I like to be with them, but I cannot. They will not have me, nor will the underworld have me. Neither do I belong here in your world, but here I must dwell, pleading with your kind until somebody incorporates my bones and sets me free. Why? How is it that you are dismembered? Why will they not have you in the land of souls? If I tell you, will you collect my bones and restore them to their proper configuration? I have never told anyone my story, for thus far, no one has remained in my presence as long as you have. It is a story that I am ashamed to tell, for it is a sordid story. But I must confess it if I am to surmount the pain of being unwhole, a skull detached from its frame that is disjointed and scattered along the shore and at the bottom of the sea, to be devoured into oblivion by turtles, crayfish, and who knows who else, or else to be worn away into dissolution by the winds, the waves, and the current. Will you listen? Will you tell my story? Wapekuku nodded without saying a word. He felt sorry for the skull, and less afraid of it now that he had at the beginning. He drew Omimi, who had come closer to his side. My name is Baykok, the skull began, and the following is the story that he told. 5 years before, my younger brother, Wabe Uzu, came home with a wife whom he'd met in his travels. Our parents, everyone for that matter, considered my brother exceedingly lucky to have such a woman as a wife. And indeed he was, and I envied him, not in a covetous way, but in a selfish manner, when I ought to have been glad and complimentary. It was easy to see from the way that Biwin looked at Wabe Ozo that her love went beyond mere love and bordered on adulation. Some of the women in the village were critical and talked about Biwin, saying that she behaved more like a servant than a wife. The way she waited on Wabe Uzu and brought him whatever he needed without being asked or directed. Wabe Uzu was as content as any man that had ever known or heard about, whereas once it had taken no more than the mention of the word hunt, fish, trip, to persuade him to leave home and not return for days. It's now become almost necessary, the hunter said, to kidnap him, to ditch him from his wife. If he was not the leading hunter in the village, it would not have mattered, but Wabe Uzu was next to indispensable. And the men jested that when they were on a trip with him, they had to watch him to make him from making off and going home. Oh, he'll get over it, they said. Ever since I could remember, my brother had regarded me as someone special. As boys, Wabe Uzu followed me as a child cling to his mother, or a fawn to the doe. Even in our later years, he preferred my companionship to that of other boys his own age. And even when he got married, Wabe Uzu still sought my companionship, inviting me to visit any time and to stay as long as I pleased. And I accepted my brother's invitation, dining with him and his wife, sleeping in their lodge, and listening to them consummate their marriage and love. Yes, the Montanos had indeed been kind to Wabe Uzu, and deservedly, for he was a good-natured, generous, trusting man who had never shown a mean bone to anyone. I hoped that the Montanos would bestow similar favors on me. I had noticed Bewin's eyes from the moment that I first saw her. Never had I seen such soulful, sultrous eyes. Soon after, I began to visit Wabe Uzu and Bewin. I thought that she looked at me with a longing that women cast only on the men they love and desire. And her glances, sultry and full of want and promise, impassioned me, though they aroused me, those eyes, and their lure and magic disappointed me. And her touches were as electric as her glances were provocative. If Bewin had to put her hand on my shoulder for momentary support, I would be aroused. A fleeting accidental brush of her hand or garment would set my flesh tingling. Up to this time, no woman had moved me so, but it was my brother's wife, who custom and decency had committed beyond my reach. What was I to do? How would I get her out of my mind? What ought I to do to avoid hurting my brother's feelings, shaming my parents, or breaking the Anishinaabe code? I knew of only one recourse, and that was to leave for a while. For 6 months, a year, or however long it took to get over this infatuation. But before I left, I told my parents, my brother, my kin, and my neighbors that I was going out to see the world, and that I didn't know when I would come back home. But I reassured everyone that I would return when my wanderlust had been quenched. In the meantime, they were not to worry. I was able to look after myself. Besides, my guardian would keep me from harm. With their good wishes for a safe journey, and my family's misgivings that were mingled with my mother's tears, I set out. But it was easier said than done. No sooner had I gone around the most distant point and beyond the sight of my village than I was choked by an oppressive loneliness and heartache. I felt an overpowered urge to turn back. In fact, I suspected my paddling for some moment and turn my canoe about, ready to abandon my flight. I wanted to gaze upon Baywin once more, to hear her laughter again, to feel her caress upon my shoulder just one more time. But if I were to turn back, the men, my friends, would laugh at me to my face and behind my back. That I couldn't bear. I brought my canoe around. Over the next few days, Baywin stole into my mind, uninvited, or came as summoned and lingered, almost real, taunting and tormenting me until I dismissed her reluctantly by force of will. During these moments, I wavered and was ready to face ridicule of my friends. I didn't care whether I hurt my brother's feelings. I was quite prepared to violate tribal practice. Only the mortification that my parents and grandmother would have to face prevented me from returning home. The nights were torture. I had no one to talk to, no face to look upon, no voice to hear except the faces and the voice of the past and the distant. Even these visions gave way to one face, one voice, and the eyes, the beautiful black eyes, asked, "Why did you leave? When are you coming back?" But as the days and night passed, the luster of these eyes faded, and the enchantment of the voice grew fainter. Half a month later, I came to the village whose people spoke the same language, which made it a little easier for me to gain welcome. But some of the elders were skeptical of my explanation that I had left my family, kin, and village to see the world. No one traveled simply for the sake of travel or for seeing the sights. Men traveled to seek out new hunting grounds, to deliver messages, to pursue enemies, or to run away. My hosts didn't put their doubts and questions to me directly in words, but I could see it in their eyes and hear it in the tone of their voices. Like other people, this village didn't want troublemakers or fugitives seeking shelter among them and embroiling them in unwelcome feud and vendettas. But because it was their custom and nature to make guests, kin, or strangers welcome, they invited me to pitch my wigwam in their village and to stay until I was ready to resume my world tour. To relieve my hosts of the burden of providing me with meat, as they have done on my arrival the previous day, I accompanied a party of hunters to their hunting ground. I brought down 2 deer. For the hunters of the village, my success was a challenge. To see whether my success was luck or skill, the hunters invited me to accompany them again. Once more, we came back the same day with venisons to feed the entire village for a week. Almost immediately, some of the hunters, convinced that I was an exceptional hunter, hint that I should suspend my plans to see the world and remain there as a member of their community. And to dissuade me from going any further, They describe the hostile nations that accompanied their territories through which I propose to pass. Besides, traveling was restricted to foot, and the weather was hard as flint in winter. It would be better for me to remain as their guests among friends in the land that had been given to them by Gichi Motono. And who knows, one of the young widows may want you as a husband, one of my companions suggested. I decided to stay another few days. If I had left, it would appear that I would reject their invitation to remain, and would surely be construed as a slight on their hospitality. The few days extended into a week, the week into a month. It was the late summer, too late to resume my odyssey. As long as I was with people, I found that I suffered less heartache, and I deliberately sought out company and conversation. Even though the chief topic of discussion among the men was hunting, and often repetitious, I and the others never tire of hearing and telling of marksmanship, or how they missed their quarry at point-blank range. Over and over, the hunters described their skills with pride, or with ineptitude without embarrassment. If I wasn't listening to their hunters' tales, I was giving all my attention to the tribal storyteller, who were instructing and entertaining the audience with their accounts. Children, too, alleviated my hurt. To see them tumble and hear them laugh, or to listen to them cry as they nurse their bruises or vent their feelings, helped me forget and loosen the bond with my past. Little by little, the bond that held my mind, spirit, soul, and heart to the memory of Bwin was slowly released. But while I was gradually severing my memories of and yearning for Bwin, I longed to see my parents and my grandmother, and kind and generous as were the people in my temporary adoptive village, I wanted to go home to my village, to my place of birth. I wondered if my grandmother was alive, how my father managed alone, and if Wabe Uzu was able to assist our father. And I recalled my mother with affection, rooted when I remembered how she used to stay awake at nights worrying until my father or I and my brother came home. She always worried. She would never change. I must be constantly on her mind, pausing now and then in her work to try to find an explanation of why I left, and to worry about my safety and my well-being. Yes, she must offer tobacco frequently to the Montanos for my sake. How long had I been away? 5 months? Long enough? Had the bond of infatuation, love, been so dissolved as to preclude regeneration and enable me to look upon Bwin with the same detachment and indifference with which I regarded most women? But when I thought of Bwin, my heart's pace quickened. It was too soon. I would not be able to withstand my urges. I decided to remain where I was until the following spring, when I would again reconsider my feelings. By then, it should be enough time. When I decided not to return home, I asked my hosts if I could remain in their village until spring. Of course, they said. We were hoping that you would stay, of course, as long as you want. Soon after, I had asked permission to winter in their village. An older woman, one of the elders, escorted me alone and inquired whether I dislike women. I guessed what she meant and assured her that I was indeed fond of women, but that I had not as of yet turned any woman's head enough to inspire her to put up with me for life. Within days, my conversation with the old woman, a young widow, invited me to her lodge, not only for the winter, but permanently. I told the young woman that I was not yet ready for marriage, but it didn't matter too much. Such relationships were not uncommon. She hoped that I would stay. The following spring, when the trees began to blossom, I, feeling in command of myself, bid adieu to my companions and friends and left to visit my parents and kin. How long would I be gone, or when I would return? I dare not say. But already, even as I plied my paddle and set forward my canoe, I felt an excitement as the image of Bwin appeared and seemed to beckon me to hurry. When I felt a tremor coursing through my hands and arms, I realized that I had not yet got over this feeling, this obsession, and that it would be better for me and for everyone if I waited for at least another year. But I went on, drawn home by love and duty to my parents, and lured by Bwin. I half hoped that something would intervene to prevent me from doing anything rash or even from fanning old sparks. Half a month later, I was in sight of my old village. While I was still some distance away from the landing area, the dogs began to bark as if I was a stranger, which, of course, I was to many of them. Their barks and howls naturally aroused the villagers, who suspended their labors to look up to see what was disturbing the dogs. "Someone's coming!" the children shrilled, pointing to the approaching canoe. "Who is it? Recognize him?" Men and women shield their eyes from the sun to make their visions keener, and thus to determine whether the oncoming paddler was a friend, enemy, or a neighbor coming home. The dogs continued to bark despite the people's efforts to silence them. Most of the villagers went down to the shore to see who was arriving, asking one another, "Who is it? Can you recognize him?" Only the very old remained where they were when the commotion began. "Looks like Pauguk," one of the onlookers ventured, as he strained his eyes. Soon after, another voice supported this statement. "For sure, no doubt, it's Pauguk. It's Pauguk. Pauguk is coming home. Somebody tell their parents. It's Pauguk. He's here. He's not dead." As if it was necessary, some boys and girls ran up the incline to deliver the good news to my parents. Then, without waiting for an answer, they ran back down to the shore and looked on and greet their prodigal from this world tour and to listen to my accounts and stories. No sooner did I beach my canoe and disembark than a dozen hands lift my canoe out of the water and set it gently on an unoccupied frame. And even before they did so, the questions began. "Where did you go? What did you see? What was the land like? The people? The animals? Were you afraid?" I was too busy greeting friends, kins, youth, whom I haven't seen in a year, to answer all their questions. "Anin, how are you? My, you've grown. Later, I'll tell you later. But there's too much to tell. How is your mother, your father? With children, friends, and dogs pressing in on me from every side, I made a headway only at a snail's pace. I wanted to see my parents and my grandmother. My father and mother then came down to meet me. The crowd of boys and girls in front gave way to allow them to come through. Anine! My father greeted me cheerfully and took my hand in his. It's about time. I thought I would have to go in search of you, he said. My father had not changed, as far as I could tell. I quickly disengaged my hand from my father's clasp and put my arms around my mother. Son, I'm glad you're home. I'm so glad that you're all right, she said as she put her arms around my waist and squeezed affectionately. Didn't you bring her home? She teased. Who? I asked, momentarily taken back by the question. Then I realized the substance of her hint and chuckled. There was no one to bring home. How is grandmother? She'll be so glad to see you. She talked about you often since you left last spring. Why, she was calling your name only yesterday. Son, I'm glad that you're home. I hope you'll stay. This is where you belong. I looked down at my mother. I saw her eyes, the same love and affection that she had always expressed ever since I could remember. Nothing would ever change that. Where's Wobe Uzu? I asked, suddenly realizing that my brother was not there to greet me. He went down to the end of the bay early this morning. He should be back by now, Father explained. As I walked up the slope with my father, my mother, and the crowd that formed a reception committee, I saw Baywin push through the crowd to welcome me. She drew herself to my side opposite my mother. Just as my mother had done, Baywin now put her arms around my waist and her head upon my shoulder. I'm so glad that you've came back. I've missed you. I inclined my head slightly and met her eyes. Had they been able to speak words, they would have said, "Come to me this day. Come into my arms. Let me hold you now and forever. I am yours." But her eyes spoke their own language, and had we been alone, I would have swept Bwin into my arms and unclothed her, joined my body to hers there on the ground where we now stood. Then and every day, forever. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and my heart beat hard and fast. I wanted to sit down to control myself. Wabe Uzu will be so glad to see you, Bwin said, looking away and disengaging her arms from my waist. I wished that she had not removed her arms, but her touch lingered like a hot brand where her arms had rested. In the excitement of seeing Bwin, I was almost oblivious to everyone beside me, and indifferent to the snail's pace of their walk home. How far did you travel? What's it like? The question continued to besiege me. I glanced up to take in the family lodge, and to note what changes, if any, had been done since I left. There was grandmother sitting on one side of the entrance, just as she had always done, as if she had not moved, bent over slightly, searching for something on the ground, and then, having retrieved whatever it was that she had been looking for, affixing her glances to another object that she had held in her left hand. From where I observed her, It appeared to me that she still looked the same. Certainly, no matter did not seem any different from what it had been. Nothing could distract her from her work or disturb her iniquities. Not thunder, earthquakes, or visitors. And now she did not bother looking up. Nokomas, I hailed grandmother. Nokomas, I'm home. And I broke away from mother and the crowd to rush forward to greet her. Grandson, she said as she embraced me. Welcome home. Sit down. As invited, I sat down beside my grandmother, and the crowd that had come settled down on the ground, with all children in front, all eager to hear my adventures, encounters with giant animals, Montanos, and enemy warriors, descriptions of other lands and other people, the explanation of the alien custom and dress. When I explained that I had gone no further than a half a month's travel westward by canoe, and I had lived with people akin in language, custom, and belief, some of the adults left to return to their lodge to resume the work that they had suspended on my arrival. Even Bee Win left with the adults, waving her hand and casting a parting glance on me before she walked away. Only the children stayed on, moored to their places by curiosity and conviction that if they left, they would miss something important. I was attempting to explain, without much success, why I had gone. I just wanted to see the world. I just wanted to see how others lived, how others' customs compared to ours. I left not because I was unhappy here, though life tended to be changeless or monotonous. When excited shouts came from the shore, disrupting my account. It's Wabe Uzu! And then even louder, Wabe Uzu! Your brother's home! I stood up, waved my arms, and went down to the shore to meet my brother and escort him back. Bee Win was there too, and it made me uncomfortable. After greeting and handshakes and back slaps, Wabe Uzu, Bee Win, and I went up to our parents' lodge, where we traded news of our experiences and our affairs during the past year, each eager to learn how the other had fared. It was an exercise in catching up. Not until we had assimilated as much news from each other to give us a sense of direction and spirit of the others could any one of us resume life and work as if little or nothing had occurred to disrupt the continuation of our relationship. We now share the same knowledge of who had died, who had become parents, who had received many favors from the Montanos, and who had remained unchanged. Only after we had become reacquainted could we turn to more immediate business of fishing and hunting. After Wabe Uzu told me where he and our father had some of the men been fishing and what they would be doing tomorrow, he issued a brotherly challenge. See if you've still got the touch. For me, the next day went as if I'd never been away. Neither my father nor my brother referred to my absence or asked me for explanation. The fishing was as good as it ever was. With the number of trout and whitefish harvest, the coming winter would be good. Tao hao, Niji, Wabe Uzu exclaimed in administration when we were done. It looks like the fish still come to you. And after making a few observations about luck and the prospects for the coming summer, he added, Bei Win and I would be glad to have you stay with us. What? That's kind of you, I broke in. And as much as I would like to accept your invitation, I really feel like I should stay with mother, father, and grandmother. It wouldn't be quite right and proper after having been away a winter and not to stay home as expected, at least for a while. I was forced against the horns of a dilemma. Considering the family circumstances and the origin of the invitation, I had no choice. Sooner or later, I would have to accept my brother's invitation. In the meantime, I would only delay, and I was afraid. One glance, one word, one touch from Bwin was all that it took to impress on me that I had not overcome my obsession. But it would be difficult to refuse my brother's offer without giving offense. It would be difficult to offer an excuse that Wabeuzu would accept. Surely mother and father would not want to keep you for themselves alone. Perhaps they'd be relieved to be rid of you for a few more days, Wabeuzu teased. Not right away. Give me a few more days with them, I pleaded. It was by begging that I managed to put off accepting my brother's invitation. But I could not well refuse the next request, that I eat with them, delivered on the basis that a meal had been prepared especially for me, at considerable trouble, and that I should bring up my palate with me. Indeed, the meal was as good as was promised, but throughout our dinner of venisons and beaver, with maple syrup sauce, smoked trout, and blueberries, which absorbed Wabeuzu and ought to have held my attention, I was distracted by Benwin's presence, her voice, and her eyes. I found it difficult to put my whole heart, mind, and soul into this meal, and into the plans for the autumn hunt that Wabeuzu unfolded. Was only when Bewin removed her top and began to unbraid her hair in preparation for bed that we realized it was later than we realized. Seeing a woman without a blouse was nothing new or out of the ordinary, but seeing Bewin bare down to her waist for the first time excited me. I did not want to remove my gaze from her breasts, which were partly draped by her hair, and at other moments fully bared and vibrant and flushed in the flickering flares of flame. Yet I had to look away. I did not want either my brother or Bewin to notice that I was staring at her body, as if I had never before beheld a woman's body. As best as I could, I tried to be casual. I considered returning to my parents' home, manufacturing some excuse, such as that I did not feel well. But I knew that no story, no matter how sound, would gull my brother. I had to stay, or so I convinced myself. When we went to bed for the night, I on my own pallet and they on theirs, I did not fall asleep at once as was my habit. Visions of Bewin's breasts appeared and reappeared. What made it worse for me was that she was there, naked, only an arm's length away, and I could hear her breath and sigh and move. If only my brother were not here. If only it was I laying by Bewin's side. If only. My envy and desire turned into jealousy and hatred. There was only one way to gain Bewin, to gain access to her side on the pallet. The very thought appalled me and kept me awake for most of the night. In the morning, I caught a glimpse of Bewin fully naked, even though it was only for a moment, as she stood up to slip a full-length dress over her head. In that moment, Baywin was never lovelier. No woman was as lovely as she. My desire was refueled. Baywin would be mine. In the days that followed, I considered going to the sorcerer to obtain poison and a love potion, but I dismissed that idea. No one except me should know of my motivation and my deeds. I would have to do it alone. Having decided to murder my brother, I considered how. Under the circumstances, it would best be to drown Wabe Uzu, a poor swimmer. If I drowned him, people would be more inclined to accept that Wabe Uzu's death was accidental. The next question was where. I could think of no better place than that of the Narrows that I had come across in my travels, 4 days paddling from the village. There the current was swift and treacherous. While we were fishing the next day, I casually mentioned that in preparation for the forthcoming fall hunting season, we ought to explore this particular area that I had passed on my homeward journey. From the tracks and marks, this place deserves closer investigation than I had given it when I had come by, I hinted. If I was correct in supposing that the place was a deer crossing, and that the surrounding area was replete with deer, then the fall hunt would be easier and more rewarding and productive. The area certainly deserved a thorough study, and there was no better time than the present to go there. With food abundant, the men could be spared a few days without hardship to their family or community. Bozu was all for the idea. We could set out any time, as early as the next morning, when Baywin would have everything ready. I had to pause to consider my brother's intentions to bring his wife. The idea had its implying features, but I knew that Baywin's presence would serve only to abort my plans. It would be better to leave her home. It was a delicate matter, but I managed to dissuade my brother from bringing his wife. It'll only be for 10 days or so. She wouldn't waste away in heartache. Don't worry, she'll be all right with her mother and father. That afternoon, we set out. 5 days later, during which I had frequently suffered second thoughts, depression, and repugnance about what I was about to do, we came to the place that I had reference to. My brother trusted, loved, and admired me. He would do almost anything I would ask. The image of Baywin appeared in my mind to reanimate my resolve. I had to have her. Wabe Uzu noticed these changes in my mood, these moments of preoccupations, though it was none of his business to inquire into the innermost thoughts of his fellow human being. Wabe Uzu felt constrained to remark, "Ta hao niji, you look as if you're lost in another world. Better pay attention, or else we'll run aground someplace and sink. I don't want to have to try to swim." "Don't worry," I replied. "I was just thinking." And Wabe Uzu accepted the explanation. "This is the place that I was telling you about," I said as we were approaching the Narrows. We drifted along for a while in the middle of the channel, studying, our paddles at rest atop the gunwales of the canoe. The narrows resembled a gorge that has neither banks nor shore to speak of. The south side was solid rock, perpendicular from the water line to the brow of the escarpment, a height of 200 feet or more. The north side was also a solid rock, but not half the height or half as rough or craggy. The surface was quite smooth, as if some giant had polished it with a scraper. Bisecting these two masses of primordial rock was a well-wooded valley, a half-mile or so in width, that bore north and south. After taking stock of the contour and the character of the channel, the valley, and the mainland from the water, Wabe Uzu and I went across the shore on the north side to study the land more closely. We saw countless tracks, all recently made, bearing inland and northward. We both agreed that this was a fording passage, and that all remained to do was to establish on which side the herd wintered, and when it was likely that they made this crossing. As we stood from the north side, Wabe Uzu pointed to an overhanging rock on the brow of the south cliffs and remarked, "Wouldn't that be a wonderful place for a lookout? One would be able to see a long way off. It would also serve as a fine retreat for dream visions." I added, "There is something sacred about that rock." "Let's go up there," Wabe Uzu proposed. "We'll have a much better idea of the land from up there. We may even see a herd. Who knows?" That place reminds me of a story of the ambush of the feared one by the little people. Do you remember, Pauguk? Do you remember how the little people, armed with stones, waited on top of a cliff for the feared one to arrive? And when that bully drove his canoe directly below their ambush, they released their missiles and sunk the canoe of their enemy? Nobody's bothered the little people since. Don't you remember that story, brother? Yes, very clearly, I answered, looking at the promontory, but I was looking at the cliff from an entirely different point of view. It was not a sacred place for the conduct of spiritual exercise. Rather, it was to be the rock of doom, a thought that made my blood and heart race. What I was about to do would be easier and less reckless than overturning a canoe. An hour later, we were standing at the edge of the precipice, taking in the vista all around to the very horizon. Although we had often wondered what the eagle and the hawk beheld from on high, we had never imagined that we would one day, as we now did, look upon their world from their vantage point. And like eagles and hawks, we looked down in silent awe at the lakes and streams, valleys and heights, meadows and muskegs, and listened to the murmur of the wind and the ripple of the waves below. Finally, after some moments, Wabe Uzu broke the silence with an observation. "So, this is what hawks and eagles see," and he stepped closer to the edge and looked down. As Wabe Uzu stood precariously near the edge, I put my hands forward directly in the small of my brother's back and thrust forward hard. Wabe Uzu pitched outward, arms waving wildly. "Yo!" he screams. Then there was a splash, and then silence. I backed away from the brink. My hands were shaking. My palms were damp and clammy, and my heart pounded as much in my descent as it had in my ascent. I frequently cast nervous glance to my right and to my left and then behind me, as if I'm expecting to see someone who had witnessed what I had done, who knew could incriminate me or held me in bondage. No one was in sight, but my ears, keener than ever before, heard footsteps, knocks, taps, raps, slaps, and rustles that made me start and throw my head around to catch sights of my pursuers. As before, there was no one except a chipmunk or a flicker on the side of a tree that darted out of sight in fear of me. I descended quickly, lest someone see or take hold of me. Down at the shore, I wasted no time boarding and launching my canoe. I made my way directly to the foot of the cliff. There, my brother's body was scratched, broken, and bloodied. On the rocks soil that extended the length of 2 canoes from the base of the cliff, a hand's width just below the surface of the water. I vomited as I levered the mangled corpse with my paddle away from the shoal to the deep. As I paddled away, I again looked all around to see if there was someone watching me. There was no one, as far as I could see, except the animals and the birds, the eagle, the sparrow, and the mole, which now shrilled in horror in their language to tell each other, "Did you see? He killed his brother." During the next 5 days, I constantly looked behind me, expecting someone to come in pursuit. At night, when I slept fitfully, awakening to every crackle, creak, and scratch, all sorts of thoughts assailed me. Was it my brother who stealthily creeped up on me in the dark to plunge his knife into my chest in revenge? No, it couldn't be. That was just a mole venturing out in his own dark world. Was it possible that my brother had recovered and would sooner or later make his way home? Was it him just then? Or was it a spirit, far worse than human, I had heard? I should have made certain that Wabe Uzu was dead before I had left him and the scene. But how could anyone survive such a fall? How could Wabe Uzu survive the ordeal of the water? I thought of Bewin. As my brother's survivor, I could now claim the young widow. I could now hold her and feel her softness. I thought of her until the next clash or screech set her hair on ends and my nerves taut to the point of snapping. In the morning, when I set out, I felt no more rest than I had been the night before. As I drove my canoe forward, neither too slowly or too leisurely, I rehearsed the answer that I would give to the questions that everyone would surely ask. Where is your brother? What happened? What did you do? I prepared myself mentally and emotionally to face the questionnaires as calmly as the circumstances would allow, and I would blacken my face as evidence of mourning. 10 days to the day after Wabe Uzu and I had cast off together, I was within sight of home. On shore was a small crowd, made up mostly of curious children who were often gathered near the beach, playing at some game or waiting for the hunters and fishermen to come home. There was some men and women as well, performing tasks that always needed doing, such as the repair and construction of a canoe or the mending of fishing net equipment. Then there were the ever-present seagulls and dogs. When I was still some distance away, the children began their game of guessing who the lone paddler might be from his style of paddling. As I drew closer, enabling the children to recognize me, the children asked, wondering where he left Wabe Uzu. But the adults were filled with presentiments and bade the children to say no more. Their presentiments were confirmed the moment they discerned my blackened face. To be meet without greetings, not even Anin, disturbed me, and though my neighbors helped me draw my canoe out of the water in an action of neighborliness, I saw, in the brief moment that their eyes met mine, that they were filled with distrust and fear, as if they could see the guilt impressed in my soul spirit through my eyes. They needed not ask what was plain. One boy, who had just ran down to the shore, did ask what the others had not dared. What happened? Where's Wabe Uzu? I hesitated, groping for breath and words as if what I been asked was too horrible to recount. We capsized in rapids, and Wabe Uzu didn't come back up. I searched and waited. Oh. And here I floundered. Children detached themselves from the crowd to run home to deliver the news of the tragedy. Within a short time, the entire community, except my parents and grandmother, knew of the accident. The messengers did not break the news to them. They didn't want to. That was my burden, of the people, young and old, who listened to my explanation of the accident. None uttered a word of condolence or offered to accompany me as I plodded unwillingly and unhappily up the grade. Some men and women remained at the beach to finish their task before going to the lodge of the bereaved to attend the vigil. They watched me with pity, but not with half the pity that they felt for my parents and grandmother. It was bad enough to be the bearer of sorrowful news, but it was worse still to be the one of the men who had helped draw the canoe out of the water asked his companions if they felt that my story was consistent with the condition of the canoe. After inspecting the canoe for an ought, one declared that if the canoe had undergone an accident, then it ought to bear some evidence of wear and tear. But other people deny this assumption, saying that it wasn't necessarily so. For me, the last few steps before I came face to face with my parents were the worst ordeal. I wavered, but I went on. My grandmother saw me first. She gasped when she saw my mask of death, and then began to keen. My mother, hearing the cry, came out of the lodge to see what had alarmed her mother. One look at me set off her wailing. Within moments, my father was drawn from the other side of the lodge to the front. Mother, grandmother, father, wabe uzu, I said, and then I choked and shook. I cried. I cried to hear and see my mother and grandmother dissolved. When I recovered my voice and regained a measure of control over myself, I resumed, halting frequently to snuffle a sob. Amid tears and broken words, I described how Wabe Uzu had become unnerved as we passed through some narrowed, and that his sudden movement capsized the canoe. How he had been sucked under in the whirlpool, as if he were drawn or pulled down into the underworld by the Matanos. And I told of my struggle to save my brother and of my own close call. I attempt to console my mother and grandmother by drawing them into my arms, but they pushed me away. Unable to bear the sound of my mother's and grandmother's soul-piercing lamentation, or to endure the pain and misty eye of my father, I withdrew and stumbled my way towards Baywin's home to deliver the news. But Baywin was already on her knees, rocking back and forth, keying in grief, calling for Wabe Uzu. She already knew. Someone had told her. My voice quivered as I expressed my sorrows for her loss. Over and over, I repeat how sorry I was, how much my brother meant to me, and how I had almost lost my own life in the efforts to save his. As I unfolded the tragedy, Baywin's ululation and her calls for Wabe Uzu grew louder and more heart-rending. Touched by Baywin's grief and longing to comfort her, and myself as well, I knelt down by her side and put my arms around her shoulders and drew her to me. I whispered, "I will look after you from now on." "No, no, no, never!" Baywin wailed even louder. At the same time, she twisted her shoulders violently to throw off his arm. "No!" Baywin hissed as in anger. Startled by Baywin's vehemence, I drew my arms back
and hurt, I slowly got to my feet and retreated, leaving Baywin alone, as she wished. As for myself, I went home to consult my parents, but they would not be comforted. I sat with them well into the night until exhaustion fell me into a deep, troubled sleep that was disturbed by images of my brother and the reflection of questions in the eyes of my kin and neighbors. What did you do to your brother? Wake up, wake up. A voice that sounded as if it was issued from the star commanded me to arouse myself. I tried to raise my head, but the effort was next to impossible. I dropped off or floated into the space of unconsciousness. Wake up, wake up. It's Baywin. She is dead. At the moment of Baywin, I was on my feet, rubbing my eyes, which refused to open of themselves. What? I asked in disbelief. What did you say? Baywin. She's dead, my father repeated. How? Where? I asked. Down at the shore. They found her just now. I didn't wait. I raced down to the shore where a crowd was gathered. I pushed my way through the ring and kneeled down besides Baywin. I reached out to caress her hands and her garments, which were wet, and I began to cry softly. Kego, a medicine woman rasped. You are not the husband. I withdrew my hand. At the same time, I looked up into the eyes of the woman, which bore into my own like rays, deep into and at the end of my soul and inner being. I saw, or imagined that I saw, the image of my mangled brother etched in her eyes, and looked away. Did she knew? Then I looked down at Baywin's lifeless form, and I shook and heaved as I fought back my sobs. I ought not have cried for a woman who was my brother's wife, but I couldn't help myself. Baywin would have been my wife. Those who were present would, of course, be curious to know why I was shedding tears without shame. Ahow, the medicine woman said, and the bearer lifted their burden and carried the dead Baywin to her lodge, where the wake would be held. The crowd moved, forming a procession behind the bearer. I remained rooted where I was, shoulders heavy, head casting down, my arms hanging limp by my side, a vision of abject misery. No one in the crowd invited me to go. It was as if I did not exist. With the entire village preoccupied with Baywin's death, I launched and boarded my canoe. Some instincts guided me into my boat. The same feeling gave motion to my arms to take up the paddle and to drive my canoe forward. I had but one objective at that moment: to get away. Where I was going, I knew not. How long would I be absent? A day, a year, forever? Did not enter my thoughts. My mind was clouded, and my vision was unclear, distorted by the mist in my eyes. I paddled all day at the same pace, like something that had been set into motion to go at this rate. I paddled onward until dusk. It was only when the sun began to sink that I realized that the day was ending and that I must make camp for the night. The moment that I suspended my paddle and rest my paddle on the gunwales, I was overcome by the overpowering weariness and remorse, guilt and sorrow. As I look over the shorelines for a suitable place to camp, my mind now took over firm instinct, or whatever it was that directed me since morning. But what was the purpose of making camp? Why sleep? What good would it serve except to go on? And what did the morrow promise? What did the land beyond the horizon have to offer? Nothing. There was no hope, no promise, no meaning to be gained by enduring, nothing except the slaps of waves upon the rocky shores. There was suddenly a scream, real or imagined. It shook me. Ah! Splash. I let the paddle slip from my grasp without being cautious of having lost it. Wildly I looked about, shoreward, upward, and outward of the horizon. There was no one, but I was shaking. Only when I went into the motion of dipping my paddle into the water did I realize that I did not have it. I glanced beside the canoe. There, looking up at me from arm's length below the surface, was Baywin. I gasped in terror. At the same time, I shrank back abruptly from the apparition, too far back. The canoe rolled over. I was upside down in the water. I struggled to free my legs from under the bar, but they were caught fast. I struggled to keep from breathing, but could not. I lost consciousness. When I came to, I was crossing the bridge of death, about to set foot in the land of souls, when the guardian took hold of the log that made the bridge and pitched it to and fro until I lost my balance. You do not belong here, killer of their own brother. Do not belong here. The guardian shrilled the words, assailing my ears as I fell into the rapids below. In the underworld, the Montagnons shrank from me and hid. He killed his brother. He coveted his brother's wife. He killed his brother. He does not belong here. He belongs with his own kind, they shrilled. And the turtles and the crayfish destroyed my flesh and sinews until the bones fell away and sank. But the Montagnons and the residents of the underworld, not wanting my bones to desecrate their world, asked the Montanos to preside over the winds and those that governed the currents to cast my bones out of the sea. The Montanos unleashed the winds that stirred the waters to boil and churn until they had cast out my bones and scattered them on the rocky shore. That's my story. Baykok said, "That's how I came to be here. I do not belong here. I do not know where the likes of me belong. All that I know is that I must leave the land of the living. I must go as I was born and as I lived, with my body and my limbs, with frame and shape. My friend, set my bones in their proper natural order. Give me form, and I will leave and go to the place where I belong, wherever that may be. Otherwise, I must remain where I am, unsettling men and women with my harping. My friend, brother, do me this small favor. Set me free from my bondage, and I shall never frighten your kin or your neighbors again. Do not be afraid. I cannot hurt you." Baykok did not answer the skull. Instead, he asked his wife, "Do you think I should do what Pauguk asks?" "No, leave him." "Oh, do what you want. But I am not staying," Mimi cried. And she stood up uncertainly and turned to the lodge. Baykok gathered the bones that were flung over a large area on the shore, and by the lights of the moon assembled them in their rightful place, according to their natural order. When the final bone was set and the skeleton composed, Pauguk was lifted and was airborne into the sky. Baykok stood and watched the night sky, and then he heard Pauguk address him from somewhere in the sea of stars. "My friend, I am between the sun and the realm of ice. Too close to the sun and I burn. Too far and I freeze. I am an outcast, even in the afterlife." As he continued to look upward, Baykok thought he heard the hiss and rattles of burning bones. Finally, when he heard nothing further, Baykok returned to his home and his wife. "Did you do as Baykok asked?" Mimi inquired. "Yes." "And what did you do with them? Where are they now?" "The skeleton ascended into the sky like a bird, and I heard someone speak, the voice of the skull. He was alternately near a fire and then frozen in his dwelling place in the afterlife." Thank you all for coming and listening to the stories. If you have any suggestions, leave it in the comments down below. If you're a newcomer and you are interested in these type of stuff, subscribe for more videos like this. But as always, have a great day, and I'll see you next time